A little while ago, I played Dear Esther, and my original conclusion was that it was a hollow game by not having an answer to its question of what happens when you strip out all the usual interactive elements like difficulty, failure states, and violence from a game. The day after playing Dear Esther, I watched a video by Innuendo Studios about it, and I would like to retract my earlier statement about it being a hollow game where the interactive element has no place in it. If you want to know how the story is told via its mechanics and presentation, go watch the video by Innuendo Studios, then come back. All caught up? Good. While I no longer believe Dear Esther has no reason to be a game over, say, an audiobook, I still wish it was. The idea is there, but that's not really saying much in and of itself. The way the game goes about exploring its key concept is relentlessly tedious, and the procedural element is only barely present to begin with. A far cry from the confidently stated Steam store page description. Every playthrough, a unique experience with randomly generated audio, visuals, and events. Yeah, sure, and every gun in Borderlands is totally unique because of a few tweaked stat numbers. The impact is the same, and only contributes to the game's theme upon replay, which itself is a problem because Dear Esther is already hard enough to drag one's feet through the first time. The thought of replaying that game without the ability to move faster than continental fucking drift just to see more or less the same exact game sounds mind-killingly awful. If I could redesign it, and yeah, this is armchair territory, but fucking sue me, I would opt for a micro open world with events that can alter the space in a single playthrough, and hack off about 40 minutes of playtime by giving the player character a real ground speed. This way, very simple puzzles can force the player to backtrack to a space they've already been to retrieve something or to interact with an object and find that it's not quite how they left it or that the level itself changed a bit, and so on. This would make the game modular not just across multiple playthroughs for its theme of murky memory, but even within the same playthrough, preventing the need to drag one's feet for only a vaguely intriguing thematic crumb that, isn't really much in the way of payoff given the sheer amount of time you're investing. So while I like what Dear Esther wants to be, I can't say I like what it actually is. Moreover, I don't like the motto gameplay over all else for a myriad of reasons. I think it's a shallow way to view games, but Dear Esther does prove one thing, and that is that a game can survive being a lot of things. It can have a terrible story, it can look like a butt, it can sound completely uninspired and flat, but it cannot be tedious, regardless of how neat the Ludo narrative is. It just can't survive being annoying to interact with physically. And that does lend credence to the idea that a game can have a terrible story and still be worth playing, but if you hate just doing things with it, it's not going to survive that, basically no matter how good the story is. And then there's Bionic Commando 2009. In stark contrast to Dear Esther, this game's story ends in a line that sounds like a euphemism for masturbation that I am 100% certain the developers did not intend for. The plot features a strong setup about how war has changed, the enemy is former allies we once served with, that the first game was a rose-tinted pop culture memory of a hard and tragic event, and that the pro-military sentiment it left the FSA with has given way to excessive military R&D, unchecked government officials, as well as the simultaneous romanticizing and neglect of war veterans. The game makes the bionic part of the title a visual metaphor symbolizing what soldiers will never be able to recover after the war has chewed them up and spit them back out. And somehow it all still ends with his arm being his wife.
You don't know the first thing about how your technology works. I helped invent Bionic Spencer. All that time we wasted trying to make a machine like a human. We finally realized that the machine must be human. Your bionics are conscious devices, Spencer. It was all just a matter of storage capacity. The mind of the catalyst melds with the mind of the host. That is why the emotional bond must be strong. Why the catalyst must be someone close. You've been using her all along, Spencer. Emily's been along for the ride the whole time.
But all in all, that doesn't really matter, because unlike Dear Esther, this game is fun as fuck. It is a strikingly unique game that retains far more of its NES heritage than its gritty, modern look and themes would suggest. A lot of games include shit just because it sounds cool on the box, but here, the bionic arm is the absolute center of the game. After a delightfully restrained opening sequence that gives you a moment to familiarize yourself with Spencer's basic actions, they give you the bionic arm. After a short tutorial for it that is very directed to the point, thankfully, the real game begins. Most everything in the game after this point is a highly deliberate exploration of the game's central premise of having a grappling hook in place of your second favorite wanking hand. Spencer is granted an absolutely absurd amount of freedom of movement that makes the environment feel a lot smaller than they actually are. This can be a bit of an issue in some areas, but the game is not about having 100 vacant miles in all directions to waste time in. That would be Fallout 3. An open world level structure would just turn the grappling hook into a glorified commute. Instead, the linearity of the level design grants the player focus, and as such, meaningful applications for their eccentric toolkit. That's not to say there's no room to stretch your legs. Trying to walk through levels is slow and tedious enough to fool you into thinking you are playing Dear Esther. You won't be doing this, though. The developers took great pains to make each zone a uniquely structured environment that facilitates the bionic arm in ways that manage to still feel entirely natural within the game's aesthetic. Furthermore, the game does away with many of the usual mainstays of modern shooters in favor of a distinctly Metal Slug arcadey setup.
Spencer, we loaded the first pod with a hiker. It's in the air now.
Not anymore.
This one's new. They call it a hiker. It packs a fierce punch with a good spread. Not exactly subtle.
Weapons are drops in the environment, and while you can find extra ammo for them, you're intended to simply pick them up, use them, and then discard them and keep going. This keeps the game's pace up by preventing the commonplace problem of making spacious environments useful to the player just by hiding a million bits of vendor trash in them that you will eventually need a lot of. The reason the game can be so sporadic with weapons is because the player's left arm is their greatest weapon. The bionic arm is good for more than just getting around. You can punch, uppercut, throw, Iron Man, and even zip kick damn near everything with a pulse. The developers even planned a contingency, so if you grab a guy and do nothing, he whips out his shock baton and goes Cole McGrath on your ass. It's great. And don't even get me started on the biomechs. They're armored targets that run at you like beasts, taunt you, and have many ways to keep the player on their toes. If you try to grab them from the front, they reel you in and sock you, trying to hang away from where they can reach you, and they'll take shots at you, or use their boosters to hunt you down. They come in many flavors and all of them are good. Some have a shield that requires speed to get past, others throw Hadokens that force you to stay on the move. Another has a big ass gun that you can actually pick up and turn on its owner. It's sweet. If I did have a complaint about the enemies, it's that in spite of the story premise being that several Bionic Commandos defected and became terrorists, we never actually fight any of them. Even Mag, who is the game's best thematic antagonist by being someone Spencer still feels bad for and sees himself in, with all kinds of mechanical implications for a boss fight where she uses her cyber legs, is instead killed last minute because it turns out Super Joe is actually the bad guy and it hurts the story momentum and all the tension they built up to that point. It's really not great. But like I said, we don't care about the story. This game's story is only interesting in concept, not in execution. Speaking of, not everything in the game is a hit. The first boss is rad. It forces you to be mobile, and the arena is excellent. But most others make little to no use of the bionic arm, and so are very forgettable. Groder in particular is a glorified QTE that's only noteworthy quality is that if you're replaying it after you died, you can tell him to shut the fuck up to get the fight going sooner, which I wish more games would do that. That's great.
Spencer, you believe only what we wanted to believe!
Will you shut up?
On the other hand is the Berserker. The Berserker boss fight happens halfway through the game and rewards you with the adrenaline meter when you defeat it. Most games halfway through that want to escalate give you a bigger gun or a sword with 20 more points of damage, but Bionic Commando actually unlocks a whole new set of skills that furthers the game's centerpiece. At full adrenaline, you can burn it to spin whip all around you or perform a fatality on armored targets, both ground and air, even when they're at full health. I seriously admire that this far through the game, they're still trying to flesh out the bionic arm and explore its mechanical implications. And what's great is that while you're mastering all these different systems, you get to enjoy one of the most underrated soundtracks I can think of from a video game. Most war titles opt to make the music ambience or some kind of moody background filler that doesn't stand out, but here, it's front and center. The game has aged pretty smoothly for a 2009 Xbox 360 title. This PC port is a little buggy, but the high resolution and frame rate only helps to highlight the rock-solid work done on Spencer as he flings himself through the air, runs along walls, and even changes his jump animation to match the direction and height of the cliff he just leaped off. Some things are a bit off, but there's still more here on display with the faces than in many recent RPGs, and many scenes add characterization by how characters express themselves. No words, just what they feel. All in all, the game might be short, around 10 hours, but almost all of it is a resounding success, and it feels like a larger adventure than its runtime would suggest, unlike Dear Esther, which is about 1.5 hours and still could lose a good 40 or so minutes. Is it the best game ever? No, but it's more than worth your time, and I would urge anyone who watches this to consider picking up a copy and giving it a go. It's not the kind of game that would likely to be remembered, but while the march of time makes Dear Esther get ever murkier in my mind, I'm going to be going back to refresh Bionic Commando.